Hello everyone, I hope you had a nice spring break and you're adjusting well to your classes after you've returned. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the crisis of loss, PTSD, and the crisis of victimization to help you on your quizzes, but also to prepare you for the final and the other exam. You're doing very well so far. You did, as a class, did really well on the midterm exam and are doing well on the quizzes and the writing assignments. I'm also excited to see your progress on your projects. And please let me know if you have any questions as we finish up the projects and you get ready to submit them on Monday of next week. So first, the crisis of loss. Just a couple points that I wanted you to think about. First of all, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief are not linear. So a client can go through starting with denial and go on to acceptance. They can go through any number of the stages, stay longer in one, pass through another quickly. It depends on the person. So if you're working with someone experiencing grief or loss, you just need to know the basics, but also get to know about them individually and personally and see how you can best help them work through those stages. Denial is an interesting stage because people use it to kind of get a break to survive until they're ready to face the reality of the situation. Now you might think this is a conscious choice that they have. I'm not going to think about this. I'm not going to accept it till I'm ready. But often it's not conscious at all. For example, I lost my grandmother in the fall. She lives back home about 5 hours away. I know that she's gone, but still sometimes in my head I think about the fact that she might still be at home. I don't do this on purpose. It's just that I haven't been used to being with her every day or on a weekly basis, and so it's easier for my mind to just autopilot and think about she's at home and I haven't seen her. I'm not choosing to be in denial, but it's a coping mechanism that my brain automatically does. The same is true for the clients that you might see. One important thing you need to know about depression in dealing with grief is that depression is often linked with suicidal thinking. And so if you have a client who has experienced loss and is expressing some symptoms of depression, it's important for you to check in with them to see if they've thought about suicide or taken any steps to plan suicide. That way you can do an accurate suicide assessment and intervene as necessary. Divorce is a great loss. It's important to know that loss, grief, mourning, bereavement, they're all not specific to someone passing away. They can be the loss of a relationship, like in divorce, loss of a romantic relationship, the consistency of a parental relationship. It can be loss or mourning, bereavement due to losing a home, losing a sense of security if the person that you're working with was sexually abused or violently attacked. Can also be the loss of a job, financial stability. It's a shift in their life, so it's not always clear-cut. One thing to note about divorce is that often divorce comes with some type of custody battle. Now, custody battle has negative connotations, but also, even in the best situation for divorce where the parties are amicable, they're splitting custody. Still a loss of time with their children. It'll never be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It'll never be every day after school. There will always be some compromise. And so parents have to grieve that loss. And a lot of times what becomes problematic that you'll see in a crisis situation dealing with a loss related to divorce and child custody is frustration and rage. People essentially forget their coping mechanisms and their anger takes over, the frustration and rage takes over, and they behave in ways that aren't typical to who they really are or typical to how they behaved in the past. So you can be sensitive to this and help them work out new coping strategies for accepting the reality of their loss and for coping with the strong emotions that will come up as they continue to face that reality. Another thing is child adjustment is often predicted by the adjustment of the parent they are with the most, so the custodial parent. You may have a mother or a father that has the child more often, based on any number of reasons, and how that parent copes with the separation, the loss, the adjustment after divorce greatly influences the child. So it's just as important for the adult to be mentally healthy as it is for the child to get attention and to be mentally healthy, because they impact one another. One more thing I'll tell you about mourning, the loss, bereavement, grief. Mourning is cultural specific. So when someone encounters a loss, a lot of times how they cope is dependent on how they've watched other people cope with loss around them. And sometimes people don't mourn in the way that other people in the culture do, and that's looked down upon. But it's important to know that however someone deals with grief is individual to that person. It's their own process, and it's their own right to go through that. If they're not functioning or causing others harm, then it's necessary to intervene, but also to respect their own needs for coping and processing in their own way. Next is the chapter on PTSD. First, with natural disaster, one thing that I thought was important for you to realize is that the community as a whole has to come together to cope with a natural disaster. And one of the hardest things for them to do is to face the reality of their own responsibility for rebuilding the community. So when a natural disaster happens initially, people will hang on to the fact that they'll get some help, and sometimes they do, but in the end, the majority of the work to rebuild the community falls on the people that live in that community, and that's really tough. Shock and denial help people survive natural disasters and crises that promote PTSD, wartime, sexual abuse, things like that. So shock and denial are not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes people just cannot cope. As I mentioned earlier in the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stage of denial, it's just a break that helps the person survive until they're ready to face the reality of the situation. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the difference between acute stress disorder and PTSD. The marked difference is that acute stress disorder is diagnosed within the first month of the event. PTSD is diagnosed after 1 month. It's important to know that PTSD is harder to treat because maladaptive coping mechanisms are more ingrained, and so the defense mechanisms they use help them survive long term. And so those things are harder to work through because they've been doing these things for so long. It's a natural habit that they now have. PTSD symptoms are often delayed for individuals in combat so they can continue to survive. So if someone is in war, perhaps they're in Afghanistan or Iraq, they may experience a really tough crisis situation. Perhaps they saw their friends dying. Perhaps they were responsible for helping those friends survive and they weren't able to. So, but this can have a significant impact on the individual, immediately and long term. But often, they don't show symptoms of that impact until they come home from deployment, because in the moment, those days following the initial event, they still have to continue to fight. They still have to continue to survive. So you'll often see veterans come back and be diagnosed with PTSD after the fact.